Today is August, let me see what date it is here, 20th, 1995, and I'm speaking from my home here in Rogers City, 386 North 6th. Sitting at the kitchen window overlooking the backyard, and from which in the wintertime I can see glimpses of Lake Huron. Now today I want to talk to you about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk to you about the home life on 3rd Street in Rogers City. About the year 1920, when all the kids were home, Mother and Dad, that's George and Alma Grambo, and the 6 kids. There was Dad, and the 6 kids, and the dog, not Dad. The dog's name was Kazan, as you would have to be. Now in 1927, all 6 kids were at home and in school. Ernesty and Therese were in kindergarten. Grace was in the 2nd grade. George was in the 10th grade. No, George was in the 4th grade. And I was in the 10th grade, and my brother Herman, who was a senior, was in the 12th grade. Now, today I think I would like to talk about the old neighborhood in that area of town, where we all knew each other, we went to school with each other, we played at the old baseball park. Kids swam together, they played baseball, football, camped together, skied together, sleighed together, went to church together, and it was a common area, you might say, for all our remembrances. We knew most of the families in that area, at least I did. Now, I don't know about the twins, maybe they were a little bit too young, but the baseball park was right across the street from our home. Today it's called Westminster Park. Now, Westminster Park, or at that time, that was an area about 300 feet on the side, and was a wonderful baseball field. In the winter, it was a beautiful, beautiful skating rink, and that's where high school football was first played. Now, it was also used for picnic affairs and also limestone festival affairs in the early days. Now, if you draw kind of about a 3/8 mile circle around our home there on 3rd Street, we knew, or at least I knew most of the people in that area. That is, we knew the kids. Oh, in most cases I knew the adults too. I didn't know them. They weren't necessarily very good friends of mine, but I knew enough to say hello, and or good afternoon, or good morning, and they probably knew who I was. But of course we all knew the kids. Now, Rogers City, as you recall, was located right on Lake Huron, and it stretched for probably about a mile. I would say the town stretched for about a mile along Lake Huron, various portions of it, various streets, but the main street in town was 3rd Street. So if you started from the area of the Catholic Church and its grounds, and then on top of that, which is now the open athletic field, came right down 3rd Street for about a mile, you'd run into the depot. And now the depot also was the depot for the D&M railroad track, which ran along 2nd Street. Now, so the town stretched along at that time probably about a mile along the lake. There were various docks that went out in the early days. Going the other way, east and west, from the area that you recall around Heff's Dock, if you went west for probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile, maybe probably a little bit about 3/8 of a mile, maybe, along Erie Street, starting from Heff's Dock, and then went up past the Heft home, and up into the area where we used to go dig worms. That is probably the area that you will recall most as the outline of the town. Now let's get back to the original idea here. We want to try to recall some of the events that occurred around the old neighborhood. And I think probably the easiest way to do that would be to start at our home there on 3rd Street, 3rd and Woodward, and just recall some of the names of our neighbors that we all knew at that time. I'll go down the list somewhat, and then you can make additions and corrections in your own mind. Now, there might be some repetitions here, and I might have missed a few people, but that's par for the course. Here we go. One of the first neighbors I recall, of course, the Bertrams, our oldest and dearest friends. Then next door to us were in my early days, were the Ewell family, and they were replaced by the Endresses, and the Endresses were replaced by the Hillas. Then there were the Valentines across the street, and the Arscotts, a little catty corner. Later, that became the home of Tony and Ann Chabella. Then there was the Crowells. Then there was the Bill Schultz family, and the Reuben Schultz family, and the Gilpin family. And then there were the Schlagers, and the Bruders, the Fishers, the Campbells, the Shurtums, the Krotskys, the Grubies, the Scrottys. There were the Hemblings. There were the Zempels, the Gregorys, the Adrians, the Furtaws, the Clarence de Vincent and Eugene de Vincent families. There were the Elmer Beatty family, and there was the Bill Beatty family. There was the Munt family, and the McDonald family, previous to the McDonalds, that had been the Conant family. Then there was the Perry house, Perry family, and the Staffords, and the Hammonds, and the Henleys, and Ed O'Callaghan's, Craig the photographer, Terry's Buick, the automobile dealer, Harold Terry, the Heff family, Herman Nagel family. Then on our along 3rd Street down there was the Reverend Belfry. That was the old Osgood house, became the manse for the Westminster Church. The first minister of the Westminster Church to move in there was a Reverend Belfry, and he was followed by a Reverend Kennedy. Then there was the Carter house, which was originally the Brown house. And then there were the Pines family, the Wilson Pine, the Tush family, the Kaler family, the Kuhlman family, the Strikes, the Schauks, the Pets. There was the Strickers and the Yerks. There was the Adolph and Lena Bertram home. And then there's, and across the street, there was the Mann house, John Mann the tailor. And then next to that, of course, was the Hagen house. And then there was the Zalebinder family, the Genskys, the Luft, the Paradises, the Craiglows, the Urquharts, the Hosloons, the Sanamos, the Buntons, the Crush family, the Harry Fleming family, the Gross family, the Wergel family, the Henry Hop family, the Brecken family, the Belmore family, the Tovers, the Wrights, the Mendes, the Albert Dulac, Adolf Dulac, the Colitz, Sorgenfries, the Brunings, the Hoax, the August Flemings, the Grewatches, the Riegers, the Atkinsons, the Brooks, the Steffens, the Plaths, the McCutcheons, the Basils, the Losians, the Hellers, the Voights, the Radkes, the Myers, the Alfred Hops. Then there were the Delgin family, the old located in the old Delgin Woods. By the way, the Delgin Woods are still there today. There was the Rudolph Delgin Sr., there was Rudolph Delgin Jr., there was Roy Delgin, there was Earl Delgin, and there was all you would recall it by name. They were known as the Battlefront, which is part of South 2nd Street. And there was Battlefront, then there was Tank Edition. There was the Mauer home, there was Mauer's Pond, there was Mauer's Hill. There was the Urquharts and Belmore Hill, where we sleighed in the wintertime. There was the City Baseball Park, of course, right across the street from our home, where they played high school football in the winter, a beautiful skating rink for the whole town. And there was also Polish Town, and there was the Bradley Farms, the big dairy owned and promoted by Carl D. Bradley. The D&M Railroad, as we said before, was just a block away from our home, and the daily train whistled at every street crossing. It ran through the entire town on 2nd Street. Just thought of a few more neighbors. The Thompsons, the Langlois, the McLeans, the Reisdorf, he was a chiropractor. There were the nuns at St. Ignatius, and there was Reverend C.T. Skowronski. You will no doubt recall others in the months ahead as you probably listen to this. Good morning. Well, we'll continue our little journey of 1927. Today is August 21st. It's about 9:30 in the morning. Now, you recall we were talking about the area around the old home on 3rd Street. The main office, I recall, of the Michigan Limestone Company at that time was on Woodward Avenue, only about a half a block from our home, located right in back of the old R. Scott and the Tony Shabella residence. And you recall that the old Bertram Creek ran right in front of that office building. In fact, there was a little bridge that went across it, so that the people coming up with cars had to walk across a little bridge. Now, in the summer, of course, that creek dried up, and now, of course, for many, many years, the creek has all gone because Mowers Pond finally dried out. Now, that building where Michigan Lime was located at that time was originally the headquarters for the Rogers City Power Company. That was a group that brought power in from Michigan Limestone plant and then distributed it to Rogers City. Now, this occurred about 1915-16. I believe that our home on 3rd Street was wired about 1915-16 and for electricity. Before that, we used kerosene lamps just like everybody else did in town. Now, before that, of course, kerosene was the common fuel used for lamps and lanterns. And, of course, kerosene was also the fuel that was used for the old lamps, lamps that used to be placed on the corner of the main street, about every block. Now, on the corner of our block of Woodward and 3rd, there was a lamp post. And atop the lamp post, about an 8-foot post, was a large lamp, iron clad lamp with glass, and that was fitted with a receptacle that carried the kerosene and the wick. And in the evening, the lamplighter would come along with a little lantern. He'd go up there and he'd put a certain measured amount of fuel in the tank of the lantern and then light it. And that would last probably 8, 9, or 10 hours, depending upon the amount of fuel. But that lamp was on that corner, and there were probably about 12 or 15 of those lamps placed strategically along the main street and also in certain areas along Michigan Avenue and Erie Street. The only lamplighter that I recall was William Schultz. He was one of our neighbors, and he was later town marshal, fire chief, and took care of the streets. And but he was the lamplighter that you hear about in history. Now, I'd say our home was wired about 1916, I believe, or 17 in there. And the man who did the wiring was a Mr. George Brooks. He was an electrician at the plant, lived just up the street. And it was a wonderful thing not to be able to turn on a switch and not have to have lamps in the various rooms of the home. Now, to get back to our home life there on 3rd Street. Right now in my mind, I can see a scene in our kitchen at that time, with Dad probably sitting in a rocking chair, small rocker, next to a big 30-gallon tank, hot water tank, which was attached for heating purposes to the wood stove. And, of course, the stove in the kitchen burned wood. One of our big jobs every year was to keep the wood that was used in the stove for heating and cooking going. We split 10, 12, 15 cords of wood every summer, every fall. The wood would come in from the surrounding areas. The farmers would bring it in on big loads. It would be split into large chunks, and our job was to split it into smaller chunks so that it could fit into the stove, probably 2 by 3 or 2 by 3 by 3 or 3 by 4 or 4 by 4. And now some of the bigger chunks of wood, of course, were burned right in the furnace itself. Before we had coal that was brought in at Michigan Lime, the furnaces in town burned huge chunks of wood. And those ashes, of course, were taken out and spread on the yard in the form of lime in there. And but to get back to the kitchen, Dad would probably be sitting there smoking on a pipe, Prince Albert tobacco, And on one hand, he'd probably be, had his hand on the head of the dog Kazan, kind of scratching out a little bit. And then the other, he was reading the local paper, the local Presque County Advance. And we call that paper, or many people call that paper, the soap wrapper. Now, the question is, somebody else asked, well, how come the soap wrapper for the Presque County Advance, the local weekly paper? Well, this is how it occurred. In the early days, including our mother would make soap. They made homemade soap, laundry soap. They used a certain amount of lye, a certain amount of tallow that they bought from the butcher shops, melted that stuff down, put in a few other ingredients, heated it, emulsified it, and then it was set in trays, in kitchen trays, you might say, to harden. And after it hardened down, it was cut into chunks probably 1 by 2 by 3 or something of that kind, just like a cake of soap that you would see today, laundry soap. And then it was set out to dry. And what they frequently did, they would wrap those chunks of soap in paper and then store them in some nice cool place so that they would harden some more, because the harder the soap, the longer it would last. Now, because the only newspaper that a lot of these people had was the Presque County Advance, it was called then the paper that wrapped the soap, or the soap wrapper. And that was a common expression. Did you see it in the soap wrapper? Now, I'll grant you that the Whiteley people who published the Advance weren't too fond of that name, but nevertheless, that is an actual fact as to how that got started. Now, back to other things that I recall about the Orr home, both inside and out. You recall that we had a flowing well on the outside, which was a dandy. That well was drilled about 1911-12 at the time that they built the house, and it hit a beautiful flow, a very powerful flow of water. That flow was powerful enough so that you could attach a hose to it and throw a stream of water right over the house. And so when that stream of water, when that powerful water came in, at the time that they built the home, Dad was persuaded to put an inside toilet system in. And that's how we happened to have a toilet in our house, instead of the outside toilet, which was the mode in those days. And so a toilet was put in, right where it is, the downstairs toilet right where it is today. Later years, you remember, there was a toilet system put in the basement. And then 80 years after that, there was another toilet put in on the second floor. But the original power of the water was strong enough so that you could use it for a toilet system, bathing, and for all kitchen purposes in the house. Now, we also, of course, as you remember, on the outside of the house, there were large 50-gallon barrels, empty vinegar barrels, that collected water off the roof, soft water. Soft water was used for washing because it was kinder on the soap. And then in later years, probably about the mid-20s, Dad, Mother built a large water system, or cistern, on the corner of the house just off the back bedroom, facing the Hilla house, you might say. That cistern was all underground, of course, built underground out of cement block and plaster, and with straining walls made out of brick. And it held about 600 gallons of water that came off the roof. All the roof water from one side of the house was piped into that cistern. And so Mother had soft water for washing the clothes in the basement. The stuff was piped into the basement area. Now you also remember that from the flowing well water, we had a water cooler in the basement. There was a small cabinet built there out of wood and metal, with metal shelves, metal pipes, and the cool water coming right out of the ground flowed through. Ran into the house, and there it ran through these pipes on a continuing basis. And you could keep butter or cream or meats for a reasonable length of time in that water cooler. That water cooler was used until such time that we got an electric refrigerator. I think the first refrigerator that we had as I remember, the name was Crosley, and that served for many, many years. And you'll recall where the refrigerator was, right there as you came in the back door, right in back of the door, that's where the refrigerator was placed. Then also, now I might say this, that the wood that was brought in to be chopped up was usually stored on the what we'd call the north side of the house, facing the Yule house or the Endries house or the Hilla house, and that's where Herm and I and Dad, with the axes and mauls, would chop the wood up for the kitchen stove. And every day, wood had to be brought in to fill wood boxes, one in the shed, the other one by the stove, and then tremendous quantities of it were stored in the basement for the wintertime of chopped wood. But wielding an axe and the mauls was a daily task in the fall of the year, every fall. Now, Mother, of course, as you recall, always had a big vegetable garden. It covered a good share of, there wasn't too much lawn in the early days, but it did cover a good share of the lawns around the house, which was just turned over for vegetables. That's where they raised the beans and the carrots and the beets and the strawberries and the rhubarb and the asparagus and a large bed of lettuce, which was in a special container on a frame that was covered with glass. And as you recall, we ate a lot of lettuce. The lettuce was raised all the way from early spring to late fall because it was in a covered area. And we had lettuce with vinegar and bacon and cream for many, many meals. That was a very standard meal many times. It just lettuce with cream, fried home-smoked bacon or fried home-smoked ham, and or also many other things that went with that. But I really fondly recall the lettuce with the cream and vinegar, and now you also remember that in our yard we had, I think, 11 apple trees and 2 cherry trees, and those apples provided, of course, a lot of applesauce. They provided a lot of apple pie, and there were several varieties there. The biggest variety that we had was called a Welty. Then we had one tree which was called a Northern Spy. We had another tree which was a Macintosh, and then we had another tree that I don't know just exactly the name, but it was a soft, very light yellow, and it was very similar to what you would call a one of those early spring trees that produced a beautiful, beautiful pie and beautiful, beautiful applesauce. Now, I also recall that in World War I, the front yard, the whole front yard, both sides of the sidewalk, the whole 100 feet, was planted. Half of it was planted potatoes, half of it was planted corn. That was common in many homes because the food during the war was more important than the grass. And so during the period of the war years, they used the entire arable land that was in the yard for production of food. Now, other people, of course, would do the same thing. We did, right after the war in 1918, Dad finally got a car, a Model T Ford, four-door, which was a hand-cranked, or hand-cranked later on, of course. There was also had a battery in it, but I mean you had to crank it to get it started. And then later on, of course, you got the Model A Ford, and then Dodges and Plymouths and others. Now, with the cars, in the early days, of course, there was a wonderful thing that replaced the old for a long period of time. It had to replace the horse and wagon, or horse and buggy, or horse and sleigh. And after we got the first car, I don't ever recall any horses being stored in a horse barn anymore, because they opened up a part of the back end and made a big large garage door so that the cars could be driven in right off the street. Now, in the fall of the year, probably about the 1st of December, most of the automobiles, practically all of the automobiles in town, were put up for the winter. Cars were put up on jacks to take the pressure off of the tires and the inner tubes, and the batteries were taken out and stored in the basement, and everybody walked. The streets were given over to the horses and sleighs, and everybody walked to everything. School, church, social events didn't make any difference, because the streets were not plowed, or they didn't have the equipment to really plow the streets the way they do today. And so cars found themselves rough going after about the last November. So the thing I recall about the mid-20s is that Dad would be making wine. Dad was a great winemaker, and he made both red and white grapevine. And I recall going with Herman out in the edge of town, up near the dairy farm, to pick dandelion blossoms in the spring of the year. We picked them by the gallons and gallons and gallons, and those were brought in, and that was the flavoring for dandelion wine. It was a beautiful, beautiful wine that he made out of that. He also made wine out of other native things, such as blackberry and occasionally boysenberry, not boysenberry, but elderberry, and on a few occasions made a quantity of wild grape wine. The only trouble with that is that it took an awful lot of sugar, but it made a beautiful wine. Mother was usually busy every day with the 6 kids in school. The biggest job, of course, was to get the breakfast made, get them off to school, and then put on the soup kettle for noon. You recall that practically every noon, when all 6 kids were home, we had soup every noon. That was soup, bread and butter, and probably a little dish of pudding or something like that to go with it. But there was vegetable soup of every conceivable type that you could think of. There was green bean, there was yellow bean, there was rutabaga, there was potato and ham, potato and bacon, and there was a variety of vegetable soups, bean soups, pea soups, corn soup. Every noon we had soup in some form for noon. And Mother was always making bread. A couple times a week, almost, she would make anywhere from 10 to 12 loaves of bread. Because when we sat down to eat, a loaf of bread would just go whoop, it would be gone. Whether it make a difference whether it was toast, whether it was fried bread, or whether it was just bread and butter, brown bread and butter. A loaf of bread per meal was standard. That was just gone. Sometimes it'd be even more than that. And so she became well known for her brown bread. And she could make some excellent white rolls, as we recall, on special occasions. And we would wolf those down like nothing. And then, of course, at Christmas time was her famous Stullen, which she made up until the very, very last days that she was home. Mother was an excellent cook of beef. I think she's one of the finest beef cooks that I ever knew. And, of course, I remember the great beef dinners, and but I also remember certain special dinners, usually at Christmas time, almost every Christmas for a long, long time. The Christmas dinner was Dramberg goose. Grandma and Grandpa Dramberg would raise a certain number of geese, and those were slaughtered about Christmas time, and we always got one. They would send some to their relatives in Detroit, and that was, to me, that was very, very Epicurean. And then, of course, there are other great meals that I recall. I would go out with Dad, or Dad would go out, Spitzer Club, at Lake Nettie, and we'd get a mess of bullheads. That wasn't too hard a thing to do. Brought them home, cleaned them, and they were fried in half bacon grease and half butter. Wow, what an ambrosia that was. Served with bread and butter and coffee. Yeah, it was a real treat. I recall the wonderful lake trout dinners that we had. I remember Mother used to send me down to meet the tugs as they came in off the lake. Buy probably two fish, each 4 or 5 pounds each. Bring them home, clean them. One we would cut up, serve for dinner that night, and the next we would save certain parts of both fish, and Mother would make fish soup for the next meal. Fish soup was always one of my favorite foods. It was served with boiled potatoes. Now that soup was boiled along with bay leaf, whole pepper, and a few other onions were put in there for flavor. The fish was boiled for a few minutes. It became very, very tender and very, very tasty. Boiled trout is a beautiful tasting food, in case you have never tried it. And that was served. That was thickened a little bit with maybe a little cornstarch or a little flour, not too much so it didn't curdle. And that was served along with boiled potatoes, a little vinegar, and boy, it was real food for the gods. And it's certainly one of my favorites. I recall other scenes that I recall were the making of sausage in the home in the fall of the year. Every fall, for many, many years, Dad would buy a whole butchered hog, several hundred pounds. It would be cut up on the kitchen table with the help of friends and neighbors. And the hams and the bacon were taken out, cut out, and they were taken to Plath's Meat Market, where he would cure them and smoke them. And then the rest of that pork, along with a certain amount of beef, was ground up and made into sausage, farm smoked sausage. The stuff was all ground. We had the grinder. We had the meat grinder. My mother and Dad had the meat grinder. By the way, that's still going today. That meat grinder, Gerald Grambo's got it, and he still makes sausage. But making sausage was a common thing for people in those days. Those who came off the farm and knew how to do it. That sausage was all ground up fine. Then it was mixed with a certain amount of beef, ground up fine. And then it was flavored with sage and marjoram and other spices, all according to formula, a certain amount of salt, a certain amount of pepper. And then after it was thoroughly mixed, then it was again put in through the grinder and into a stuffing machine. And then the material was put into casings, and put into rounded chunks of sausage that you see in the stores today, tied off. There again, that was taken down to Plath's for smoking. And after the stuff was all smoked, the hams, the bacon, and the sausage, it was brought back, and a lot of it was stored just off the back entrance. There was as you recall, at the back entrance of the home, the back shed, there was a storage area there, which was an area above the stairway going downstairs. And these items were suspended from hooks on pieces of string, rope, and that was the smokehouse, residue of what you would call the smokehouse. And Mother would go out and get down what she needed, and whether it was sausage or bacon or ham, cut off what you wanted, and hung the rest up. Now that was, as I say, this was very common in Rogers City in those days, because so many of the people that had come into Rogers City had come in from the farms, and those farmers, they not only made regular smoked sausage, they made blood sausage, they made liver sausage, and a variety of other Polish and sausages that you see in the markets here today, kielbasa, was made the same way, or by with their flavor, the Polish varieties, bratwurst, and so forth. Now, with the exception, speaking about our dogs, you remember all our dogs were named Kazan, K-A-Z-A-N. Now, the name Kazan came from a book. James Oliver Curwood, who was a native of Owasso, wrote a book called Kazan about an Alaskan dog. And we were fascinated by that name, so instead of calling the dog Mike or Joe or Pete, we just called them all Kazan, one after the other. Somebody said that it wasn't very original. Well, we thought it was original. Now, we had one exception to that, and that for a period of about 2 years, we had a big St. Bernard named Blondine. She was a very highly pedigreed dog that Dad had secured from an Otto Erleb who lived out in Iowa. George, you'll remember that when you were out there in Iowa in 1927, we visited that Erleb and saw where he raised those dogs as a hobby. And when we visited out there, he told Dad he would send him one. And so Dad, he bought one from the fellow. And so it was sent by express, express mail, came in a beautiful cage. And we enjoyed the dog. Here was this unusually different dog for Roger City, a St. Bernard. The only trouble was that after the dog got to be a pretty good size, around 100 pounds, he didn't want anything to do with anybody except the members of the immediate family. He would growl and charge at him. And that was a little frightening because, after all, this was one hell of a big dog. He would come in the house and everything was fine as long as nobody touched him except members of the family. So Dad wrote Otto out in Iowa, and Otto said, well, he was coming to visit relatives out in Hawks, and he would stop in and see the dog. So I remember the day that Otto came, he walked out to the back area where we had the dog in a large pen, a lot of room to run. He wasn't confined that way. And the minute Otto walked up to the fence to beat him, the dog charged and hit the fence. And he was puzzled. He tried it several times, and he said to Dad, George, he said, he's no good. He said, you'll have to get rid of him. He said, that is not typical of a St. Bernard dog. They just should not do it. And he said, you get rid of him, and he said, I'll send you another dog, no charge. Well, we got rid of the dog, but Mother said no, she didn't want any more big dogs of that size. That was just too much for her to handle, and Mother loved dogs. That's why we had dogs. Mother loved dogs. They were her companions while all the kids were away at school. She could talk to the dogs would do anything Mother wanted them to do. And I don't know whether you realize it or not, but the dog, that was Mother's pet. And but anyway, we got rid of the dog and continued with our mutts, farm dogs. If a dog died, we just went out to the country or let it be known. Dad would let farmers know as they came into the bank that he wanted another dog. They said, well, come out and get one. He said, my dog just had pups and I need to get rid of him. So we took whatever it was. Now, oh yes, another thing I recall about those early days, and that is that we had a curfew in Roger City in about 1926, 27, 28. The curfew rang at 9:30 in the evening. The fire whistle blew, a big siren blew. Or before that, the fire bell rang, which was a large bell attached to the village fire hall. Now that was supposed to signify that anybody under 18 years of age was supposed to be off the street by 9:30. That gave you time to go to the first show. If not, then the marshal was supposed to lock you up. Well, he didn't lock too many up, but there's lots of kids, of course, he couldn't catch. But nevertheless, the curfew was there, and the idea was that you were supposed to go home and hit the books for school the next day. And that, of course, was located at the fire hall. The fire hall is right down where the city fire station is, and the city hall is. Also, you recall the gazebo. The gazebo, when you were a young kid, was located on the courthouse square, sometime across the street from the courthouse square. But as I originally remembered it, it was in the courthouse square. And as we mentioned once before, that came into being probably along about 1904 or 5, as near as I can recall. That gazebo was built out of a kit, and that kit for gazebos was sold to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of communities throughout the Midwest. Every little town had a gazebo. And I've seen some of them in some of the small towns in Michigan that look exactly like the one we got. Well, why not? But anyway, the gazebo was located there, and that's where the city band played for Friday night band concerts. The gazebo is still in Rogers City today, but it's not there. It's located in the center of Westminster Park, right across from our home. And it is used as a kind of memento occasions of people there. Young people get married there. And it's a little bit too small for the size of the bands that they have there now, but most of the band concerts today are still played on the beach. And they have a little special platform down there, a little place where they play. But the city band is an old institution. In Rogers City, it probably goes back 100 years. And it's still city supported. Most of the people that play in the band today are the members of the Rogers City High School band, but there still are a few of the old timers that, and now, we used to, I was going to say that, well, I'll talk about that afterwards. Now, Hef's Dock, which you recall, where we all went swimming, and where old P.H. Heft had his yacht, the Topaz, and at that time yet, maybe in the middle of the 20s, it was about the last time that the big D&C boats came in there, passenger boats. You probably, maybe George remembers some of that. But that dock went out in there probably about 500 feet into the lake. And now, before that, there were docks there. During the period of time that was so much of the lumber was shipped, and so many of the immigrants came in here, there were small docks went out there. But the boats that brought these people in were schooners. They had a draft probably about 4 or 5 feet, 6 feet. Now the big D&C boats, the big boats that came in carrying passengers and freight of all types and descriptions, he needed a draft of about 12 feet. And so I think it was along about 1907 and 8 that that Heft arranged to have a company come in that dredged an area to the depth of about 14 feet so that these large passenger boats could come in and tie up safely. And they could bring in their produce and take out their passengers or bring in their passengers. And these were two-wheeled large ships. And you see pictures of them here in the local paper yet. And I took several trips, 3 or 4 trips probably, to Detroit, Cleveland, and Toledo on those D&C boats. I rode down, I remember one in the city of Mackinac, another time in the city of Alpena, that I remember the name of the boats. When I was hit with polio at that time in 1913, they took me to Toledo by boat. Also in 1914, when Mother went down for an appendectomy to Robwood Hospital in Toledo, they took her by boat. So that was a common method of transportation before the train. Now, the trains actually had come into Rogers City about 1911. In fact, I think I mentioned that one time. I beat the train by 3 days. The first train that came into the city of Rogers City came in on the 18th of December 1911, and I was born on the 15th. Mother said you beat the train by 3 days. But the dock, of course, Hef's Dock is no longer there. Where that dock was is now a marina, a small boat arena, small harbor marina. Got about 180 slips there for recreational boats that come in from all over the lakes. And another thing I remember, and you will too, is that Mother and Dad, I know from the earliest times I can remember, always had a live-in maid that stayed at the home. This is, I mean, the home on 3rd Street. When the house was built originally, they didn't finish the upstairs with the exception of the back bedroom, which we recall was the bedroom for the girls. That was a smaller unit in those days, but that was put on there right at the top of the stairs going upstairs. And that's where the maids, these were live-in girls. These were girls that lived in during the course of the week. They came to help Mother and Dad take care of the kids. They helped with the washing and the ironing and the dusting and the sewing and the mending and you name it, babysitting and so forth. They worked